All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming and joining us for another one of our civic sessions. Ashley and I are here representing the Heinz College Politics and Policy Club. We've been having a few of these, what we've been calling civic sessions recently, trying to provide opportunities for students to engage with local leaders who are doing the work in government and playing a huge role in how we, not just as a community here at Heinz, but as residents in the 18th District, probably most of us, if you live in Pittsburgh, get to interact with Washington through our elected representatives. So today we're so thankful to have Congressman Mike Doyle here representing the 18th District. That's pretty much Pittsburgh up through the Mon Valley and some areas around. Congressman Doyle's been such a great representative of the district for over 2 decades now, but also in some really particularly interesting policy ways for Heinz College and Carnegie Mellon as a whole, working on the Energy Committee and particularly in Communications and Technologies, founding the Robotics Caucus in Congress, and really with an intense focus on issues like net neutrality, internet privacy and protections, as well as many, many more we'll get into today. So, Congressman, thank you for joining us here at Heinz College, and I hope everyone can give you a warm welcome.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be here. CMU's, I'm fortunate in my congressional district to be home to many, many universities, and it's been part of the key to Pittsburgh's success and transformation. And certainly at the forefront of a lot of that has been CMU, and it's been a pleasure to work with many different people here at the university to help move our region forward.
Yeah, and that's kind of some of the things we want to talk to you about today. How the region's changed and how it's moving forward through not just institutions like Carnegie Mellon, but UPMC, the other colleges and universities. But one of the ways we like to start off these events is kind of getting into your philosophy a little bit and what public service means to you. And I was hoping you can sort of just explain that to us and where that philosophy developed and how it's changed over your career so far in Congress.
Yeah, well, I grew up here in Pittsburgh. I've lived in my congressional district the entirety of my life. My father was a steel worker down in Braddock. My grandfather was a steel worker in Rankin. So I was a blue-collar kid growing up in Swissvale and thought I was pretty much going to follow my father into the steel mill because that's what a lot of people my age did during that time when the steel industry was still booming in this region. Instead, I got a chance to go to college. So don't hold this against me. I went to Penn State. My brother's a Pitt graduate. My younger brother straight through to his PhD here at Pitt. So a lot of my values, when I got elected to Congress in 1994, I felt like one of the things that I wanted to do was to be a voice for the middle class and working families that grew up in the Mon Valley. I watched the economic hardship that a lot of people went through when the steel industry collapsed. But then I've also been able to witness the transformation that our region made from one that was a heavy manufacturing economy to one that's much more diverse now. And part of that diversity was because of the partnership between the universities and the medical center, our foundations, and the public sector. Sort of a partnership that helped us grow. It's nice to see young people being able to stay in Pittsburgh after they get out of college. That wasn't the case when I graduated from college. I say the reason there's a lot of Steeler bars all over the United States is a lot of people had to leave the region, but they didn't lose their love for the Pittsburgh Steelers, so they just made sure there was a bar they could watch a football game at, no matter where they were. But I have 4 grown children ranging from age 43, well 44, yesterday was his birthday, down to 30. And they're all graduated from college and they've all found jobs in Pittsburgh. And they all live in Pittsburgh, and my 2 grandchildren, which I'm going to get to see this evening, are also within a 40-minute drive. So that brings tremendous satisfaction to me, but more importantly, my focus has always been on economic development in the region first and foremost. But then you find out when you get to Congress, Congress is a very committee-driven system, and you eventually get assigned a committee to serve on, and oftentimes you don't get on the committee you want to be on right away. As a freshman, I knew from the moment I got to Congress that I wanted to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee, because that is the committee with the broadest jurisdiction of any committee in Congress. It's one of two exclusive committees, and it works primarily on healthcare, communications and technology, and energy issues, and some other issues too. But that was not to be. Freshmen don't get on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So I started on the Veterans Affairs Committee because we had a lot of veterans. My dad was a 100% service-connected disabled vet. I thought this was a way to give back. My brother Pat, when he graduated from Pitt, went to work at the VA and just retired from there after 40 years running the speech pathology and audiology service there. And I also served on the Science Committee because it was a peek into the future, and that has always intrigued me. What are we doing on committees like that to further innovation and technology in the United States? But after 3 terms, I got my stint on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I've been on that committee for 20 years. I'm a senior member on the Energy Subcommittee, and I chair Communications and Technology. A very interesting committee, and in this day and age, given our technology, social media, the internet, I authored the net neutrality bill to keep net neutrality principles in the internet, and we're now dealing on 5G deployment, and the key to that is being able to auction C-band spectrum, and we're in the process of negotiating a public auction which is going to bring in upwards to $40 to $60 billion in revenue to the government that we're going to be able to use to help deploy rural broadband, to deal with NG911, to help close the homework gap and the digital divide in this country. Oftentimes things we want to do and we all agree on in both parties, there's no way to pay for it. And this is going to provide that pay for. So I've had the chance to work on a lot of interesting issues in my committee, but also outside my committee with the Robotics Caucus. I founded the Autism Caucus in Congress 20 years ago. We just got that reauthorized. I've done a lot of work on gun violence and gun control. I led a sit-in on the House floor with civil rights icon John Lewis because I just got so frustrated that every time there was a mass shooting, that all we do was talk about thoughts and prayers to the family, and Congress wasn't doing anything about it. And we couldn't even get the easiest of bills through the House floor. So a lot of us decided to do an old-fashioned sit-in, and some of the newer, younger members saying, well, how are we going to do the sit-in? I said, we're going to go in the middle of the House well there, we're going to sit. Yeah. And I said, I did this in the 70s a lot, so I know how this works. But then they turned off the cameras, the CNN cameras. They didn't want people to see us doing it, and it was the new members that understood how to stream things outside the House floor. Yeah. So it was like 2 generations helping one another. We showed them how to do the sit-in, and they showed us how to make sure that the rest of the world saw it when we were doing it. But it's been an interesting career, but it's fascinating to see a lot of the work that we're doing in Washington, how that's helped transform Pittsburgh too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, there's always so much talk of the Pittsburgh Renaissance, right? And I'm just wondering, in such a diverse district, going from, Pittsburgh proper all the way up through sort of the Steel Valley that was so kind of devastated by the steel industry loss, depopulation, growing vacancy, not just industrial, but also residential, Is the Renaissance true for everyone? And how do we maybe try to make it a bit more equitable if it's not?
Yeah, well, it's not true for everyone, obviously. My district has some of the most affluent communities in the county and in the ports and everything in between. And while we have marveled at how certain neighborhoods in our city have been revitalized, and houses that used to sell for 40 or 50,000 are now selling for 300,000, we also have pockets in the Mon Valley, in parts of the city of Pittsburgh, that have not seen that success. We have problems around gentrification, where some people who used to be able to afford to live in certain neighborhoods can't afford to live there, and we don't have enough affordable housing to accommodate people that are being pushed out. So clearly, while we're learning to manage this growth and we're excited about new companies and new people coming into our city and the tax revenue that brings into the city, we have to make sure we're dedicating some of those revenues to make sure that everybody benefits from that. The other thing is that in a lot of neighborhoods, what I've experienced is if you have no one in your neighborhood that works in a STEM technology, you're not exposed to it. And so I'll never forget, right here, the Girls of Steel robotics group had come to me, and they wanted to expand the program. And I said, where do you have the program now? And it was at the Ellis School and Shady Side Academy, and I was thinking, what do you have in the city of Pittsburgh or the Mon Valley? How do we get young people exposed to these kinds of careers early at grade school level? You can't wait till they're seniors in high school to start to tell them about it. And when I talk to CEOs of technology companies in Pittsburgh that tell me that workforce is their biggest worry, you know, that they can't get a pipeline of skilled workers coming through, we realize we have a lot of challenges to do, but also to make sure that we're exposing people in all neighborhoods to what a career looks like. I always talk about Google. You know, the first time you walked into Google in East Liberty, there was like a pinball machine and a pool table and a hammock and free lunch. And as a young person, you're like, hey, what do I got to do to work here? Because this looks like a fun place to work. But you realize a lot of people don't understand, well, what are those skill sets? How do you compete in the 21st century economy? And it doesn't require necessarily a computer engineering degree at Carnegie Mellon, but it does require some basic skill sets that a lot of people don't have yet. And so we're trying to reach out to community colleges and other technical programs to let everybody participate in this new economy. They hear things like artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and they're thinking, well, that's just for really smart people. I'll never work in those fields. And the reality is there's employment opportunities for everybody if we put the right focus on exposing people to it and then making sure that they have access to the kind of training they need.
Yeah, and I think, you know, so much of these issues they span every level of government, from you know, your borough councilman's office to your city councilman's office to your office, Senator Casey's, Governor Wolf's. How, you know, from the federal perspective, what can be done better to support the types of changes that you're talking here? You know, so much of it seems to be funding, but we're always at this constant stalemate with that. And you know, we have a few more of those questions kind of tying back into, you know, Medicare, Medicaid, some of the changes that have just come out with the budget. But from this perspective of your local priorities, what are some of those levers that you can pull to start seeing, to maybe rev up some of the change that's already taking place?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'm able to do in my role. And when you think about it, the federal government, for a large part, is a conduit of funds down to the state and the county government. So a lot of times we don't directly fund the kind of programs that I'm talking about, but we can help provide the resources to do that. The other thing is you have to have partnerships with your colleagues in state government and county government and local government. So I have, my district is the entire city of Pittsburgh and 56 suburbs around the city of Pittsburgh. It has 710,000 people in it. Well, a state rep district is about 60,000 people. So I have 10, 11, 12 state reps in my district. I have 3 or 4 state senators in my district. We have a county executive and a county council. We have a mayor and we have city council. I meet with all of them regularly, and we even once a month try to have a little get-together of the leadership in state, county, and city government along with us to talk about where we can work together, where there's gaps that I might be able to fill, or projects that they're working on. The other thing is you have a certain degree of influence as a member of Congress to move private sector leaders too. I convened a meeting at the Energy Innovation Center, which was the old Conley Vocational School, which I helped fund to turn into the energy, and we brought all these CEO techs in around this whole idea of a robotics program in grade school. And if they were expressing so much concern about having a workforce, what were they doing to help the community develop a workforce and to make sure people have these skill sets, and were they willing to put their money where their mouth was in terms of if we set up certain programs, are they willing to help us fund these programs? Because it's like you're saying, some of these school districts that I approached, they said, we'd be glad to do it if someone would pay for it. We can't raise our school taxes. And, you know, in this student body of a couple hundred students, we might only have 10 or 12 interested in the program, and we can't spend that money for 12 people and not for the other 180. So those are the kind of things you get to influence as a member, to sit leadership down, to talk to the foundation community, and to make sure that, you know, we get people pushing behind initiatives that we see as growth initiatives for the region. So that's the other way we can be helpful. That's not just a direct appropriation of money.
I'm curious too if you could speak to, you've shared a lot about your experience in Congress and what that's like in DC, staging the sit-in and things like that. There's a lot of tension in Congress right now with things that are being able, just a little, with things that are able to make it through the House and then die in the Senate. And I was just curious if you could speak a little bit to perhaps your experience with that frustration and what sort of things you see could potentially help ease that tension in the future.
Yeah, we have passed over 400 bills in the House of Representatives that are sitting over in the Senate, 276 of them bipartisan measures. 4 bills that I passed sit over there. Gun control legislation that the president initially said he would sign on closing the Charleston loophole and on background checks, passed the House of Representatives and have been sitting in the Senate since February. Mitch McConnell refuses to move those bills. It's frustrating as a member of the House to have people say that all the House Democrats are doing is impeaching the president and we should be doing our work, when we're doing our work and it's all sitting over in the Senate and not moving. And that's the reality of it. You also have to understand, when you have divided government, and I've been in Congress 26 years, I've only been in the majority for 7 of those 26 years, okay? So I understand what it's like to not be in charge as a member, and how you don't get to set the agenda or have a say-so on what bills hit the floor that have a chance to move. One of the great things about being in the majority is we have that opportunity now. But we have a divided Congress. The House is controlled by the Senate controlled by the Republicans, and the House by the Democrats, and there's a Republican president. That means you're not going to pass legislation that isn't bipartisan. And even when you pass some bipartisan legislation, it doesn't guarantee that it's going to move in the other body. But it is possible. 4 of the bills that I authored and passed through the House this year, 2 of them have passed the Senate and been signed by the president. That's quite an accomplishment in this climate we're in, but these were bills that had wide bipartisan support. One was my Autism Reauthorization Act, 5 more years of money for services and research about autism. Passed the House, the Senate, the president signed it. The other one, because of my chairmanship in communications and technology, was the Robocall Bill. This year, there will be 60 billion, with a B, robocalls made in the United States, 80% of which are illegal. We passed legislation which makes the cellular telephone companies put blocking technology free of charge unless you opt out. Now, if you like robocalls, you can opt out. Yeah. But assuming that you don't like them, they'll be blocked. And then the practice, too, of where you see a number that looks like your local exchange, and you answer it and you find out you're talking to someone in another country, that's going to be blocked, too. And about 20% of robocalls are legitimate. I got one the other day. I have a doctor's appointment in Wexford at 2:15, and I got the call saying, make sure to bring your insurance card and you know, and your credit card and be there by this time. Okay, we're not looking to block those kinds of legitimate calls. But I guess the point I'm making is in my committee, we find a lot of our issues really aren't Democrat and Republican issues, you know, and that if you approach your colleagues on the other side of the aisle and try to take their concerns or what their interests are in the legislation you're working on, you have a much better chance of getting it through the process. So I, as a rule, always try to work with my Republican counterpart on the committee when I'm introducing legislation or where we have legislation. Now, it doesn't work all the time. There's some legislation we just can't agree on, or concessions we're not willing to make, and we move forward because we're in charge and we have the votes and we do what we need to do. But I think, you know, in divided government, and we have a divided country right now. I mean, you look at just about any poll on any divisive issue, then it's 50-50. We have to work together, because if you're not getting anything done, then it's all just talk. And I'm like to consider myself a pragmatic progressive. I'm progressive, but I also want to see us get things done. And if that means I got to work with my colleagues on the other side that share some of those interests, we should do that. We should look for opportunities to do that and get things done.
Well, I appreciate your work on the robocalls, because I think I might make up about 1 billion of those 80 billion. So
when we were having the hearing on robocalls, as the hearing was going on and a member was asking questions of one of the experts, he got a robocall on his phone. So I don't know if that was staged intentionally or not, but it was very effective.
Yeah. Well, maybe just, you know, I kind of want to maybe dig down into some of that experience about working across the aisles, and maybe try to generalize it into some lessons learned through your career, because, you know, I think hopefully some people in this room might, you know, become congressmen or congresswomen as well in the future, but maybe we might not always be working in that, you know, give and take. We're out of leadership, now we're in leadership, we're going to set the agenda. So do you know, have some general advice, some lessons learned about how to influence an agenda when you might be on the outside looking in?
Yeah, I just think it's not just in politics, right? It's just about anything that you endeavor to do. You need to build relationships with people. And it doesn't matter, you know, and that's people that think differently than you and people in a different party. You know, the shoe gets on the other foot eventually, right? And the way you reach out to people in the minority and work with them on legislation is the way they'll reach out to you when the election changes and you're in that position. And I've never had trouble walking up to the chair of my committee when I was in the minority and asking, say, I have an amendment I'd like to get in your bill. And oftentimes I was able to do that because I had a collegial working relationship with the people that were in charge, because I still wanted to get things done. And I just think that, you know, whether it's any profession you work in, the ability to, you know, build relationships and be collegial and to understand other people's concerns is going to benefit you greatly when you want someone else to understand yours. So I think, you know, you can be effective in Congress. You don't have to be in the majority. And every one of the bills that I passed, I had a Republican co-sponsor. I always seek out someone on the other side to ask if they want to put their name to the legislation. So I think that's an important lesson to learn, and if you learn it early, I mean, if you want to be a flamethrower, and we have them on both sides of the aisle, we have flamethrowers, they have flamethrowers. But my experience over the years I've been in Congress, I've never seen the flamethrowers pass a piece of legislation. They're there for a different reason. They're there to resonate a message or something. I'm not a flamethrower. Like I said, I want to see things get done. And I don't really care if, when I was in the minority, I could come up with an idea and the chairman would say, that's a great idea and we're willing to go forward with it. But you got to give that to a Republican and you could be the Democratic co-sponsor. In other words, you can't be the lead co-sponsor. Well, that didn't bother me if we could get the bill passed. You know, and I think sometimes you just have to learn how to navigate, no matter what it is you do in life, if you want to accomplish things, that if getting it done is what the goal is, then it shouldn't matter who gets the credit for it, as long as you're getting it done. And I think that's a rule that served me well, and it's advice I give to new members in my delegation. I'm the dean of the Pennsylvania delegation, which doesn't mean much other than I've been there longer than everyone else. But we have 5 new members in our delegation. 4 freshmen, 4 dynamic women from southeastern Pennsylvania, and Connor Lamb, who's like a freshman and a half. He come in a special election. And I sit with these members to find out what their long-term goals are in terms of their committee assignments, to make sure that we're positioning them to get on the committees that they want to be on. And like as was done for me when I was a young member, I try to just give them a sense of how the floor works, how to be effective on the floor, how to build coalitions. Some come with experience in that, others don't. And I think that's important. I benefited from it, and we try to pass it on to our new members.
I think it's really important to hear from our congresspeople. I'm really glad that you were able to share that with us today, that it is really important what gets done, not whose name is on it. I think it's refreshing for us to hear that from congresspeople and know that they actually think that. It doesn't always feel like that. I'd like to take a second to dive into some of the actual policies that you've been putting forth. I'm really interested in your Save the Internet Act and the idea of net neutrality, and I know that that might be something that not everybody in the room is super familiar with, but something that we as such a technological school affects a lot of us and will affect us moving forward. So I was just wondering if you could share some of the tenets of that policy and where you hope to see net neutrality moving in the future.
Yeah, and this has a long history in the FCC, depending on who the FCC commissioner was. But, oops, I think my microphone fell off. But anyways, several FCC commissioners, both Democratic and Republican, have tried to implement a policy at the commission. It's never been done by legislation. And what I was witnessing throughout my career, it was like a game of ping pong. When a Democratic FCC commissioner was in place, net neutrality rules were tried to be put in place and ended up in court, and vice versa. Then when a Republican come in, they'd undo them. So our attempt was to put it in statute so that once and for all, it would become law. And the legislation that I put forward mirrored pretty much the net neutrality rules that Tom Wheeler had set as FCC commissioner, excuse me, during the Obama administration. And the basic tenet is really that we wanted to stop a couple of things that were occurring before we had rules: blocking, throttling, paid prioritization. The idea that in some areas of the country, people have access to maybe one ISP, especially in rural parts of the country. I mean, here in Pittsburgh, right, you can have Verizon, you can have Comcast, you can have, you have choices here. But in a lot of places, that's not the case. In fact, about 80% of the landmass of the United States, there's only one ISP. If that ISP is able to block content on the other end, because maybe they own, Comcast owns NBC, right? You have this, a lot of consolidation that's taken place where some of the content providers have a vested interest and the ISPs do. And what we're saying is that information between your ISP and your content provider, should flow freely back and forth without anybody degrading the service or blocking the service or charging you more money to get access to the service. And so part of the rules we set up was there would be none of those three: no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. Now what you hear from the ISPs in the industry now is, well, we don't do that anymore. Well, they don't do that anymore because we set up rules saying you can't do that anymore. And not that they never did it. And then we went one step further because we know sometime in the future somebody's going to figure out a way to game that system again, and there has to be a policeman on the beat. And we believe that policeman should be the FCC under Title II. The Republicans wanted to put this under the Federal Trade Commission, which is, I don't want to call it a toothless tiger, but they have no enforcement provisions. They can only act if someone files a case, and then they can maybe have a fine. But the FCC had more power to regulate, so we wanted to keep it there. The Republicans wanted to put it in Title I. That was always the battle, and it went to court several times. So what we did is pass a bill that said not only that you can't do the three things: blocking, throttle, pay public. We also said the FCC will be the cop on the beat, and that if they see any other anti-competitive behavior going on, that they have the power to act on it. Now, I told the ISPs that if they're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing, they had nothing to fear from a rule like that, because they told me every time they met with me that this law was unnecessary because they weren't doing any of these things. And I said, well, if you're not doing any of these things, this law shouldn't hurt you. So just because maybe you guys might pull a quick one on us, if we want to have the bill. Well, we passed the bill on the House of Representatives, and it sits over in Mitch McConnell's graveyard. And in intervening times, we had an election for president, and the current occupant who sits in the White House appointed Agent High, who is the current FCC commissioner, who immediately undid Tom Wheeler's net neutrality protections. And now there are no rules right now. Now, the ISPs have been on rather good behavior because they know we're just waiting for them to go back to their old habits and call them on it. But I still believe that the answer to this is to put this in statute and once and for all stop the ping pong. Because I assure you, if we win the White House, the next FCC commissioner will be a Democrat, and we will reinstitute these laws that are in my bill. But it seems better if we can get it done in statute. But that's basically it.
Oh, thank you.
It seems like a lot of tech regulation comes down to, like you were saying, well, we're not doing it, but you could. And where the regulations kind of seem to fail to really pick up a lot of steam, and we've seen this with different committee testimonies where Mark Zuckerberg will come and there's some questions that seem to require maybe a little bit more education or context behind these really technical regulations that could be so meaningful and could significantly structure our society.
And a little more honesty on Mark Zuckerberg.
Well, yeah. I think I would agree after watching those. But like, how do you have for a very long time been kind of on the forefront of some of these really technical telecoms and communications issues. How do you try to maybe bring some of your colleagues along and kind of build this understanding?
So I think what people are starting to realize, data is the new gold, right? And so the question is, who owns your data? And what are they allowed to do with that data, with or without your permission? I think a lot of people, when they hit the I agree button, don't know what they're agreeing to. But if you ever downloaded the terms and conditions, saying, I want to read these before I agree, and if you can get through these 16 or 20 pages of legalese, you probably still don't know what you're agreeing to, but you know if you don't click I agree, you're not getting in. So we all agree. And basically, when you think about this, now that all this power has been shifted over to the Federal Trade Commission, if a company lists its terms and conditions and they don't violate their terms and conditions, they have done nothing wrong. People are starting to understand how their data can be used and accessed in ways that maybe they don't want to agree to. So the question is, how do we develop a policy that provides transparency for people, at least knowing what it is you're agreeing to? How do we put those terms and conditions in a language that a non-attorney can understand? And how do we provide an option if you don't agree to that? You know, the whole thing behind Facebook is it's free, right? Orrin Hatch didn't know it was free, but most of us understand that Facebook makes its money. But in return for that, you're giving them a lot of information about you and your habits, your buying habits, your social, you name it. And that's being monetized and sold to third parties, although they claim they weren't doing it. So the question is, how do we make people aware? And so what's the alternative if you don't want them to be able to use your data? Is it become a paid service? Are people willing to pay to say, this is my data and I don't want it shared with anyone? And if I have to pay $10 a month or whatever the fee might be to do that, people should have those kinds of options. The other thing that we're struggling with is Section 230, which provides a liability shield for these platforms. You know, the people that have the platform saying, if we're liable for everything that gets posted, on our platform, we'll be out of business in a day. So the question is, how do you have a set of rules? And right now what we do with these is we tell them they need to police themselves. And if they don't make a reasonable effort, I think is the legal terminology, to do that, then they could bring enforcement action. We had them in front of my committee a few months back. And I basically said, you know, I don't want to abolish Section 230. I think, you know, the implications of that for innovation would be what. But if you don't want the federal government fixing this problem for you, you need to fix it yourself. And I really think there needs to be, you know, and I think there needs to be the sort of Damocles hanging over their head, that the last thing they want is for us to come up with a solution for them. And the way to avoid that is for them to do a better job policing what goes on sites. I'll say another thing as a political person. When I put an ad on television or I send a piece of mail out to you, I have to put a disclaimer at the bottom saying paid for or approved by Mike Doyle for Congress. A lot of us feel that political advertising on the internet should also have some sorts of disclaimers on it so that you actually know who this is that's sending you this information. Is it coming from the candidate themselves or others? So there's lots of things being looked at. And then, you know, who's responsible for what's true or not true, you know, when it's posted on a platform. And as we saw in the 2016 election, we know that there was interference in the sense that information was being put out purported to be from groups or people that it really wasn't from. It's not that we think people got in and hacked the actual vote totals, but we think that a lot of influence was played by outside governments, and we still argue about this to this day, to influence people on the election. So these are not, there's not easy answers to these questions, because you don't want a policy that completely stifles innovation in this sector. At the same time, I think people need to be somewhat empowered, at least to have the transparency that they knowingly, you know, when they're talking to Alexa, or that they're just not talking to her.
Yeah.
Lots of other people are hearing and saying that, and I think, you know, that's what we struggle with.
I'd like to shift topics for a second, if you don't mind. Another policy issue that's very prominent here on CMU's campus, and I'm sure with you being in the Energy Committee as well, is climate change.
Yep.
And I know that you've worked on legislation with your colleagues to help the U.S. get carbon neutral by 2050. And I was just wondering if you could speak to some of the ways that you think Pittsburgh could be an innovator in terms of helping with climate change moving forward, and some of the things that you see as areas of progress within Congress and also in Pittsburgh.
Sure. First of all, I think when you think about one of the most important issues that we're going to face as a country and in the world is whether or not we're going to show leadership in addressing global warming. And we know from the scientists, if you read the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is basically the gold standard for scientific research on climate change, that we're being told that if we allow post-industrial warming to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, some very bad things are going to happen to the planet. And for people your age and your children. And so the question is, how do we address that? I believe in science, and I believe that when we're looking for a solution, that we should be guided by the consensus that comes out of the scientific community. I also understand that we have to build consensus, because if we don't build consensus, and if we strand assets in communities, we're going to fail. 10 years ago, I helped write the last climate change bill that was in Congress. It was called ACES, and it was a cap and trade system. Back then, it would have already started a reduction of over 20-some% by 2020, the year we're in right now, and eventually by 2050 would have got us to an 80% reduction in carbon, which back then was the standard. We passed that bill by one vote in the House, 219 votes. We couldn't get a single Republican to vote with us. And the Senate, which was controlled by the Democrats at the time, wouldn't even take the bill up. And then Republicans won 61 seats the year after, and we haven't seen climate legislation for the last 10 years. That said something to me. If we fail again to pass legislation and start us on the pathway it could be another decade before we ever see that again. So we can't fail. So the reason that we can't fail is that we have to start something. So it's not going to be one big perfect bill. We know what we need to do. There's about 8 sectors of the economy that we have to look at, right? What are the big ones? Well, we know the power sector is one of those. We know transportation sector is a big one. We know buildings are a big one. And so as we look to fashion this comprehensive bill, which the climate scientists tell us we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 and net zero carbon by 2050. That's the goal. It doesn't say we can, if we can get it done quicker, not to do it quicker. And I think there will be technologies emerge that will allow us to do this quicker. But if we don't get it started, we're going to fail. So what's the key to that? Start where you have consensus. Where do we have consensus? Building efficiencies, new building codes. Federal government's the largest owner of buildings in the United States. We can get Republican support. We can work across the aisle to start to retrofit buildings, starting with the federal government and coming out. And I would let those contracts out locally so that we create jobs around it too, so that people see ways that reducing greenhouse gases and buildings is 30% of our greenhouse gases is something they can make a living at too. It can't be a West Virginia scenario where we said coal no more and promised people jobs somewhere that never materialized, and we turned a solid blue state into a solid red one. We have the same situation here in Western Pennsylvania. Everybody wants to ban fracking, okay? You ban fracking tomorrow, 2 things happen. Number one, there's not enough renewables on the grid yet to replace the base capacity that natural gas is giving us. Natural gas actually was the bridge fuel from coal. When we stopped coal-fired plants and converted to natural gas plants, that was a net positive in greenhouse gas emissions. They went down. Now we have to see how do we get all fossil fuels off the grid. And the way we're going to do that is with storage technology. Some of it being done, research right here in your university. I have a bill that it creates a tax incentive for the development and deployment of large-scale batteries that can store renewables. We have to make intermittent power act like base power, because sometimes when solar and wind are producing electricity or power, we don't have demand. And sometimes when we have demand, they're not doing power. So the key is to be able to store that power so that we can use it when we need it. So what I propose is this is a transition that's going to take place after time. Right now in our region, not in Allegheny County really, it's in the counties around Allegheny County. I think we have 1 fracking well in Allegheny County, and I think it's at the airport. Most of the fracking is done in the counties around us. You might notice that those are all solid red counties, by the way, that are going to vote for Trump big time, okay? And we have members of our party saying they're going to ban the practice on day 1. Good luck winning Pennsylvania under that scenario. And so what I'm proposing is you've got to show a pathway to people for the future. If you're working in an industry, and it's not just the people fracking, it's the suppliers, it's the restaurants, it's all the economy that gets built around the natural gas industry because we happen to be sitting on, you know, this huge supply of Marcellus and Utica shale. If there's not a pathway to the future, we talk about these jobs in green energy, they need to see them. We need to develop them. And we need to have people make that transition. Remember, we're talking about a transition to net zero carbon by 2050, not 5 years from now. And the other thing is, the climate scientists tell us, if you believe in science, that this cannot be done without carbon capture, because China and India and other countries are going to continue to burn coal for years and years and years, and we've got to capture that carbon. They tell you if we cannot meet net zero carbon by 2050 if we don't continue to have nuclear power too. And France, 70% nuclear. I always said they can sign the Paris Accords. 70% of their power is greenhouse gas free. We're closing prematurely nuclear power plants because of the cost when they come up for relicensing. they will most likely get replaced by a gas plant, which is gonna put greenhouse gases into the air. So every time we shut down prematurely a nuclear power plant, we're putting more greenhouse gas in until we reach the technology that allows us to get enough renewables on the grid to replace the base capacity that we're gonna lose. And in the process, develop technologies and locate the technologies in Appalachia and start to give people some visible signs of where their next job is gonna be as we phase them out of the gas industry. To try to do that in a year or in 5 years is a prescription for failure. It's a prescription for division. You're going to take a very big base group of Democrats and that work in all the building trades, and you're going to turn them all into Trump voters. I'm not looking forward to doing that. So I think there's ways that we can start on the things we can get consensus on. And to me, that's the electrification of our transportation systems, the building codes. We should be doing those things right away so that we are starting to do something. Work on transitioning ourselves off of the fossil fuels as we develop technologies to put more renewables on the grid. Ending all subsidies to fossil fuel companies. We shouldn't be giving those guys a penny. And all that money that we give them should be put into renewable and technology to help us get more renewables on the grid. We're going like $650 million to fossil fuel. What the hell are we giving them? Excuse me. Why are we giving them that much money? These are mature industries that don't need subsidized. So, you know, that's what I think we should be doing. My biggest fear is that we're going to fight with each other. You know, the Green New Deal versus the Clean Futures Act. This is a prescription for failure, okay? We have a piece of legislation that's comprehensive and mirrors the IPCC's recommendation. The Green New Deal is a non-binding resolution. It's not a piece of legislation. If it were in legislative form, we could at least compare the two bills. But right now, for someone to say that you can't be for this bill if you're for that bill, that makes no sense at all. It's not even a bill. So I would say that many elements of the Green New Deal are in the Clean Futures Act, by the way, because the Clean Futures Act is a climate change bill. The Green New Deal is a non-binding resolution that deals not only with climate change, but a myriad of other issues that would be in about 5 different committees, not just all in the Energy and Commerce Committee. Some would be over Ways and Means, some would be in Agriculture. So my fear is we're going to fight amongst ourselves. We're going to have this circular firing squad, and the Republicans aren't going to give us a vote. And then we do nothing, and then Trump wins Pennsylvania, and then we don't see another climate change bill for another 4 years, and then we're really in trouble. So I hope we can, you know, as we dialogue on how to get this done, again, the word pragmatic, that we understand we should do what we can do and do it immediately, and the stuff we can't do yet, we need to build consensus for, so that we can do it someday.
Right. And you know, maybe I think we want to give everyone some time to be asking some questions, but I do want to maybe close on one question from our end of things, because you did touch on a few things I was really interested there. That, you know, this pragmatic progressivism, and then we're looking at, I'm sure based on some of the things that you were just mentioning, there's plenty of people in the progressive movement that would say, like you said, that this is not progressive, this doesn't do enough, this doesn't meet anything.
Yep.
But then when you look at social media ads like we were talking about before, I'm sure there's people on the Republican side of things saying, you're a socialist. You know, like it's kind of, I coming from Scranton, Pennsylvania, Matt Cartwright,
Yeah.
I've seen the ads against him, and it's a less strictly secure blue district than maybe
Trump won the district by 10 points.
Yeah, and things are moving pretty quick, and he is pragmatic, progressive, I think would be a term he would use about himself.
Yeah.
But online, he is a socialist. So how do we try to bridge some of these gaps in our political discourse? And actually, you know, is this like does bipartisan exist when our rhetoric is this way?
I think, you know, social media is the way you get defined on social media is it tends to be extremes one way or the other. You know, I can be a socialist and a right winger at the same time, depending on who's, you know, putting up a post. I've learned not to read my Twitter or Facebook sites. I don't believe in giving trolls any satisfaction by engaging them. I let other people on my Facebook and Twitter site engage them for me. and then they get bored and they go away. But I'm saying, I don't think we can be governed that way. You know, people are gonna say what you are, but I still come back to I wanna get stuff done. And if the search for the perfect, you know, ends up in nothing getting done, then it's just talk. And a lot of people talk about their vision for a perfect society. And it's not that it doesn't sound perfect, the question is, can we do it? Based on what everybody else thinks. Remember, in our government, you need 218 in the House, 60 in the Senate, and a president to sign it. If you can't do that, it doesn't happen, right? So take a look at our Congress right now. 41 of our new seats that helped us put us in the majority were Republican House seats. So 41 of our freshmen come from formerly Republican districts. These are not wild-eyed progressives. These are center-left moderates, 41 of them. The reason Speaker Pelosi won't put legislation like the Green New Deal on the House floor is it imperils those 41 members. And she lost the majority back in 2010 when we did ACA and cap and trade at the same time. And you know, we pushed it through the House and we didn't do a good enough job of you know, building enough public support outside of it. And we lost 61 seats the year after that. And we were wandering in the desert for the next 8 years. And it has no intention of giving those 41 seats back to the Republicans by putting a bill forward that will never see the light of day in the Senate, right? So that's what being pragmatic is. You know, she's a pragmatic leader in that she says, look, the country's gonna be better served if we're in charge. And if we put this out and we're not in charge anymore, what have we done? So I know she gets criticized sometimes, you know, why isn't this being done? You know, why wasn't this done sooner? This bill you guys put forward, you don't do it quick enough. That's gonna lead to us not doing it at all. And all I'm saying is at some point, we have to be pragmatic about what we can. Now, if we had 280 members in the House Democratic Caucus and 63 members in the Senate and a Democratic president, hell yeah, we'd be able to do all that stuff. But that's not what we have. And even when we had the Senate, when Barack Obama was president, we didn't have 60 votes. And we had, you know, from time to time, some members that would walk us, you know, conservative Democrats that just weren't going to vote on certain things. So we have to understand what our caucus looks like too. Our caucus is a broad caucus. We have Democratic Socialists over here, Blue Dogs over here, you know, and everything else in the middle. That if we don't have 218, we're not doing anything. So, yeah. And I find myself sort of, you know, I'm a progressive Democrat. And yeah, a lot of Republicans think I'm a socialist, but I'm not I'm a Democrat. I'm gonna make that clear. I'm a Democrat, and I will always be a Democrat in the party. And I think the definition has changed a lot in what that means. So I don't know if you guys watched the debate last night, but I found it very depressing. I thought, I hope no one's watching this.
No. Well, I had a feeling some people might have some questions for you about
sure.
the current state of political affairs, so and plenty of policy issues too. So
great.
everyone want to be conscious of your time, so we should be able to get in quite a few questions. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Antonio Ladico, a long time constituent, first time dialogue. I guess second or third time, but So you talked a little bit about the building trades unions and kind of partisan support. I mean, generally known that trades aren't hotbeds for political activity, but are there things that Democrats could do as far as a carrot, policy-wise, to show the trades that they're working in their interest, and how do you put that forward?
Yeah, you know, right now, they've done some polling of the various trades, and their members are just vote slightly more Democrat. This is not 100%, but they're very susceptible to going completely the other way and endorsing. They just worry. They're worried about their jobs, right? They're worried about their health care. So you hear union people say to you, we negotiated and gave up wages for better health care. You know, We had a package of money, and we said, you know what? We'll take less per hour. We want this better healthcare plan. So then they hear about, you know, that maybe that healthcare plan is going to go away, and they're not sure it's going to be better than what they have, right? And then that's something they fought and negotiated for. It's the same with their wages. They look at the wages they're making now, and the people that are working in some of these, so they're making somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 a year. And then they see what some people are making at the local solar panel and wind company. They're non-union, and they're making about $28 an hour when these guys are making $50. So they're not looking to go from making $80,000 a year to $30,000 a year either. People want to eat. I always tell the story that when the missionaries decided to go to Africa to convert Africans to Christianity, they didn't talk about Jesus first. They went over there with food and helped them rebuild, and it took care of the basic needs. Then they talked about Jesus, okay? Well, it's the same with if we're going to try to win over people who are making their living in an industry that we're going to phase out. And it is going to get phased out over time, not in 5 years, but over time. But there has to be a transition. There has to be a pathway for people, you know, and if you don't show them that, they're not going to trust you. You can't say, trust me, there's going to be green jobs for you after we abolish your industry next year. No one believes that. And they'd be stupid to believe it because it's not true. So I just think that, you know, the way you win people over is you work with them, but you also make them understand that you're not going to abruptly pull the rug out from them. Ernie Moniz, he was the DOE secretary under President Obama, very bright guy, and he wrote an article called The Green Real Deal. And what he's saying is that any legislation that strands assets in communities is going to fail. That we have to, you know, that has to be taken into account. Now, you know, some people think, well, we're gonna take your job away, but the government's gonna give you a check. You know, people don't want a government check. People want the dignity of a job and the self-worth that comes from working. And so I think, you know, the key in the long term, and the way I see it happening is, we're gonna start to need less and less. I mean, think about natural gas. Already, fracking is down 35%. The gas is so cheap, it's being left in the ground because there's not markets for it. Now the big thing is they want to, you know, they want to take it down and export it across the country to where people are paying a lot more for LNG and others. But you know, a lot of these operations are laying off people. It's going to continue to be that way as we need less fossil fuel on the grid, as we get more renewables on the grid. But it's a process that's going to take a little bit of time. The other thing is technology. What's the worst thing about natural gas? It's methane, right? The emissions that come off of the methane. And they're toxic, right? And in some ways much more toxic than some of the greenhouse gases. At the University of California, Santa Barbara, they're working on a process right now that converts that methane, they mix it with molten metal, and what comes out the other end is pure hydrogen and no greenhouse gases. They make that completely greenhouse gas free, and it turns into an inert solid. Now, the challenge right now is they can't scale it. But I believe firmly that as we move forward in the process and people start to see markets and investment opportunities for technologies that help us get to where we want to get quicker, that you're going to see these things come to scale. When battery storage systems come to scale, when these kinds of technologies come to scale, we're going to be able to make strides that we don't know about today. But we have to start, because if we don't start, there'll be no incentive for anybody to do these things. And that's why I think it's important to get this thing kicked off with the things we can get agreement on and keep pushing it, you know, and keep selling it. And as these opportunities become available, and if we start to take money off of fossil fuel subsidies and putting them into renewables, whatever we're doing infrastructure-wise, we should be strategic about that too. If we want to start to replace fossil fuels, those strategic assets should be placed in areas where we're going to phase out the fossil fuels, so that we have somewhere for people to go. That's how you get them on board. They don't trust us right now. Okay? They look at West Virginia. They don't trust us.
Specifically, you see nuclear as the bridge that's appealing to the trades, or you see it as not?
I look at it this way. I think it's very difficult that we're ever gonna cite new nuclear sites, okay? So the question that concerns me is that we don't start to shut down sites prematurely that still have useful life, because that hurts our ability to get to where we wanna get, right? So, you know, they tried to do 2 new on green sites down in the south, in South Carolina and Georgia. I think the one in South Carolina went belly up, right? They're still trying to do the one in Georgia. But more to me, I want to make sure that the ones that still have useful life can be relicensed, and we can still use that. People shouldn't, you know, you can't say you're for solving climate change and saying, well, I don't want carbon capture and I don't want nuclear. Well, then you don't believe in science, okay? So, I mean, we either do or we don't, and I'm not a smart climate scientist. This is what they're telling me. So I believe them, and that's what we're gonna do. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Hi, I'm Cameron, Swissvale resident.
My nephew's Cameron too. So.
A lot in common.
And I grew up in Swissvale, so you're, you know, that's okay. What's
so
up?
this is the second presidential proposed budget where the Trump administration wanted to eliminate the public service loan forgiveness program. And for me, I maybe would not have selected a school as expensive as Heinz, but the government gave me the opportunity.
It costs a lot of money, though.
You know?
I know.
Do you and your colleagues see that as a covenant that you've made with students like myself to preserve that program?
Yeah, let me say first of all, the president's budget is dead on arrival in the House of Representatives, okay? Nancy didn't tear it up in public, but believe me, it's sitting in a waste can somewhere. We have no intention of passing the president's budget, and we absolutely are going to keep those programs and try to actually get some more funding into those programs. Student loan debt and access to college today, we're looking at $1.5 trillion, I think, of student loan debt. We're seeing college costs, they go up and up. I have 4 college graduates in my family, and I know what that costs. And you know, 4 college degrees, 2 marriages, I'm not bankrupt yet, but I'm close. and for students to come out of school having the equivalent of like a very expensive car or a very reasonable house on their backs, and they don't own either, and then to try to work that off, I just think it's unconscionable. And I like the whole idea behind public service too, that there's a give and take. It's not just, hey, it's free, but you're going to do something that helps the community, and in return for that, we're going to forgive that debt. I am totally committed to programs like that, and we're going to enhance and try to get more appropriations into those kinds of programs. So don't concern yourself with anything you see in the Trump budget. That's just Mick Mulvaney being delusional.
All right, thank you.
Yes?
Hi, my name's Thomas. You were talking about how, you know, you were a congressperson who believes in science, and you have these advisors that give you this information. I understand that congresspeople have multiple different resources for getting access to this source of advice. I'm interested in careers providing that type of advice. For you yourself and your people, which resources do you find most helpful? Who do you go to? Where are those jobs?
Yeah, so the way this happens for us, and when you talk, you know, Congress has something they call regular order, how we put bills through, and it first starts with hearings. This is where we get a lot of our technical expertise. The people we bring before us to give us testimony and that we can ask questions to tend to come from universities and think tanks, Rand Corporation, but mostly university is a big source, and then there's some think tanks. When we have our hearings, both sides get to select witnesses. We get more than they get because we're in charge. And sometimes they'll bring someone that has a little different perspective on an issue than people that we have. So that's one source, right? The other source is, as a member of Congress, our committee staffs are a lot of them are very, very expert in certain matters depending on what subcommittee they're working for. Some have been there on the subcommittee for many, many more years than the members of Congress that they give information to. They're career people, and this is their area of expertise. on your personal staff. I mean, my telecom staffer is probably one of the smartest telecom staffers on the Hill. He knows a heck of a lot more about everything than I do, but he's my primary source of information. And then as a member, we get access to some of the best and brightest minds in the world just by asking. They come because they see it as a public service too, that if we're trying to wrestle with an issue or solve a problem, and they have an answer for us, or they have something we need to consider. I've never had a witness or someone we've asked to come and sit with us say no. May not be the next day, but they come. So that's where it's in your research. And this is why research budgets are so important too. We have to have people going into these fields, and there has to be money for it. Oftentimes when there's budget cuts, one of the first things that get cut is R&D, because in a lot of areas people don't see the benefit from it. I see it dramatically here in Pittsburgh because of places like this, UPMC, Pitt. You see the talent that's coming out of the university. You see the people that are attracted to Pittsburgh that wouldn't be here if it weren't for the facilities we have here. The Robotics Center, which Jack Murtha and I helped build, is the reason you see a lot of autonomous vehicle companies. I mean, Red Whitaker was doing autonomous vehicles in the DARPA challenge before anybody knew about them 30-some years ago. I have people ask me all the time, how do you guys get to be all these autonomous? I'm saying that's old news in Pittsburgh. They think we just know steel mills. We've been doing a lot of this for a long time. But it doesn't happen without support from the federal government too. And we're the first funders of basic research. And if we cut that off, and people say, there's no money for the research, they don't go into those professions, and we lose some of the best and brightest people. They go write algorithms on Wall Street instead of doing research to cure cancer. We don't want to let that happen. So, but that's where it is, and we try to maintain that funding stream.
Well, I think during the Heinz College Career Services State and Local Government Week, such a career-oriented question is a great place to end it. Thank you, Thomas, for that perfect segue. But I just want to thank you so much for coming and joining us today. I know Ashley and I are incredibly thankful to have had this opportunity to converse with you so closely, and I hope everyone else enjoyed.
I really enjoyed the back and forth, and I know every year they say that this year's the most important year ever for an election. This one really is. Okay, so I'm not telling you how to vote, but I am telling you to make sure you vote. Okay? Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.